So what are we going to be doing today? This is like the intro to REST in the context of SharePoint. On Wednesday afternoon, about 2 o'clock, Andrew Connell will be talking about how you can make those same kind of REST calls from outside of SharePoint, right? Well, you're inside of SharePoint, you don't have to deal with quite as many things because authentication is already there, right? We're already in the context of SharePoint just trying to make REST calls into SharePoint. However, everything I'm going to tell you is also applicable to making calls outside of SharePoint, right? To calling out to external data and bringing it in as long as the current user has access to that context, right? Then their token can be passed along and they can get access to that information as if it was in SharePoint. So we're going to be focused specifically on SharePoint workflows that want to make REST requests. But anywhere inside of SharePoint, this will be applicable. So anytime you want to make a REST request inside of SharePoint, the stuff we're learning about in the very beginning, what I'm calling the REST primer, right? Some introductory concepts that will get us into how to build an actual REST request within the SharePoint Designer interface. All right? We're going to talk a little bit about JSON because that's the popular and, I'm going to say, concise way to exchange information today. We're going to talk about some of the SharePoint 2013 constructs. That won't take us too long, and then we'll jump straight into the demos. We only have 1 hour to cover this topic. That is a very short amount of time. I typically would spend maybe a half a day going into all of the depths of what makes up SharePoint REST. That said, I think REST is the future, right? REST is going to give us access to not only SharePoint data, but data in any system, anywhere, that we can create, review, update, delete, or manage, right from a URL, if you will. So let me talk a little bit about the terms that will be involved. Representational state transfer, what a stupid name, right? If they'd asked me, I'd have said, why don't we call it query by URL, answer by XML, right? That would have been a good way to say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you the ability not to create some kind of an object in some kind of back-end language, right? But to make a query right from the URL with all of the necessary things to filter, sort, group, paginate. Those kinds of things are all built into the query string parameters we can send in to get data back. If you've been around long enough, this is how we used to do it in the ASP Classic days, right? We used to call up a URL and get data back and then do something with it in a hidden iframe. Well, that's similar to what we're going to be doing here, just no hidden iframe. At least we don't have to manage it. SharePoint will do that for us. So the industry calls it a platform-agnostic, self-describing, web-based data querying language, protocol, tool. I'm not sure it really has a nomenclature there, right? But Microsoft calls it OData. So their implementation of REST is called the Open Data Protocol. And initially, they set it up as just their own thing, and then they invited other companies to come in and be a consortium to define what this Open Data Protocol looks like. And it's pretty slick. Right? The implementation that Microsoft has for REST is cross-platform now. So you can query into SQL Server, you can query into SharePoint, you can query into Windows and so forth, all directly from this concept of the Open Data Protocol. We'll also be hearing the word Atom and Atom Pub thrown around. Now, Atom is like RSS 2.0, if you want to think of it that way, but there's a thing called RSS 2.0 that kind of competes with it. But when people were unhappy with RSS, they collaborated to create Atom. They came up with a whole bunch of names and settled on that one. I don't believe it stands for anything. But Atom Pub is the way that we can use that XML format to update things. So Atom is about publishing. Atom Pub is about updating things. The default for SharePoint REST is Atom and Atom Pub. Well, Atom specifically. When we query in, we're going to get back XML in the form of Atom. Does your browser natively know how to present Atom? It does not. So when that XML comes back, it's going to say, hey, you made a request on the URL, and you're trying to get back some XML, and I don't know how to show it to you. So we're going to have to deal with that. We'll do that momentarily. All right. There's another term called JSON, and JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And JavaScript Object Notation is about making that XML that's very verbose. Every begin and end tag, right? And every grouping tag and every header tag and so forth is repeated, and it's quite verbose. So they squeezed it all down with tildes and little hats and symbols that JavaScript could understand and could evaluate that object and create a JavaScript object, right? Again, self-describing, because you can say, hey, JavaScript, what properties does this object have? Secondarily, it was like XML in that it could be hierarchical, right? So I could put an element with properties and elements inside of it, with properties and elements inside of it, and so forth. So it was really only a matter of time before JSON surpassed XML as the preferred way of interacting with web-based things. We want concise responses back that are self-describing, right? So that's what JSON gives us. I'll show you what JSON looks like because you're going to have to know how to parse it, but it's not very difficult. You take the outermost element, slash the next element, slash the next element, slash the property you want, right? It's very simple, sort of XPath-oriented way of getting at the data that's in a JSON object. There's also a new thing out there called JSON Light. Now, JSON Light is a specification that you put into the header when you request a JSON object back, and you can say, give me all of it, give me some of it, or give me none of it, right? I can make a JSON request that just updates something, so I don't care about the response, right? Or I want everything, give me all the details. In SharePoint on-prem today, it's all the details, right? It's the last one down there called verbose. That's a Windows 10 prompt. It just keeps giving me that same prompt again and again, like, you need to re-credential yourself, and I don't do anything, it's fine, so not sure why he keeps asking me. All right, so if you're in Office 365, SharePoint Online has the ability to get those other two properties. I don't always have to ask for OData verbose. I can say I want minimal metadata or no metadata, or I can just not even specify this parameter at all, and they'll give me minimal. Okay, so that's the default, if you will, minimal metadata in SharePoint Online. So if you do the same REST query on-prem as you do online, different responses, right? Because on-prem, you'll get verbose, and if you don't specify, online, you're going to get minimal metadata. So just be aware of those differences. Of course, I presume that SharePoint 2016 will have the same JSON Light support that Office 365 has today. OAuth, I'm sure you've heard this term, right? It's a means by which we can authenticate users. It's the open standard for authentication. This one actually was started by someone else. If you ever heard of OpenID and the disaster that that created, OAuth is like OpenID 2.0. And Microsoft has latched onto it despite the fact that a lot of industry pundits say it's not secure. It's inherently not secure. That said, it's secure enough for everything we're trying to do in today's world until the hackers get ahead of us again. Okay, so as long as your OAuth is following current specs, you should be fine for now. All right, so the idea is that we are going to be in an already OAuth authenticated context. We're going to call REST queries from within SharePoint. So it's SharePoint calling SharePoint. If you call outside of SharePoint, that same OAuth token can get passed along on your request header so that whatever system you're querying, if it's OAuth aware, right, will be able to return back the results. Okay, so again, I'm covering what we can do inside of SharePoint. If you want to hear about how you can go outside of SharePoint and query in, which of course you cannot do anonymously, you can only do that from an authenticated context. And so AC is going to talk about that on Wednesday at 2. Talk about how you can get into SharePoint from outside of it, all right? Through a request digest or making your own bearer token where you pass in the OAuth token yourself. All right, REST is one of 3 client object models, CSOM, JSOM, and REST. It was introduced in 2010 and then exponentially expanded in SharePoint 2013. Anonymous REST calls are not allowed. So I've gone in, I've set the anonymous flag on the web application, I've set every anonymous mechanism that I can, and then I try to call into it. Nope, I can see it in a browser page, but I can't see it in a REST call. And that's just the way that it is, right? You can't get to that data via an anonymous mechanism. On-prem, we're going to have OData 3.0, whereas in the cloud, online, we're going to have OData 4.0, and that supports batching. Probably the biggest ding that REST gets is it's chatty, right? It's got to go back to the server again and again and again and again for every single request that is made. Whereas with CSOM and JSOM, we can batch up our requests and say, do these 30 things all at once. We can now do that in SharePoint Online. And I believe that's one of the things that AC will be demoing on Wednesday, batching. So how do we match all of this up? I said query by URL, answer by XML, right? Or JSON if you prefer. So how do we do that? We match those up with the HTTP verbs. So we say, we want to create something, so we're going to post it. We want to go get something out of SharePoint, so we're going to get it. We want to update something in SharePoint, so we're going to put it, merge it, right? We want to delete something, so we're going to call delete. And then if we want to query something that's more than a single item, we're going to call get again. That's retrieve, effectively. So CRUD-Q is the way that we map to those HTTP verbs. Now, if we want to have a more concurrent SharePoint, the default is last one in wins, right? So if you get something and your user updates it, and then I get something, my user updates it and inserts it, right, or updates it, then you send your response in second, you're going to just overwrite whatever I sent in there, right? Even though you retrieved it before I did, when you send your response back, the default behavior is just to overwrite. So last one in wins. I said first one in wins. Well, how do you say that? Last one in wins is what I really should have put up there. Because the last person to go ahead and update an item is the one that's the update that sticks. Unless you check for the E tag. Now, the E tag is part of the HTTP protocol. It's sent down, and it basically says, this is the version I gave you. And then you can say on your post back, hey, is the version that you gave me still the version that it is? If it is, go ahead and make that update. If it's not, stop, right? Send me a response back saying, you have an old version. Do you want to go ahead and repost and override, or do you want to do something different? So how do you want to handle that? It's been my experience that the vast majority of clients are fine with last one in wins. Those that aren't are usually not prepared for the price of creating a concurrent solution. But that is something that SharePoint does support through the REST protocol. All right, so we have several endpoints that we can start with. The underscore API is a virtual location in every single SharePoint web where we can go and get the self-describing information that says what we can then get from there, right? So if we just go to /_API, we'll see all the things that we could get from there. Some of the things that we could get is the site collection that we're in. So the metadata information about the site collection we're in and all of its child collections, or the web that we're in. We can also call into search, we can call into publishing, we can even call into user profile services from here. So these are endpoints from any SharePoint web that we can use as a launching point to go off and query I'm going to call it the huge hierarchy of information that SharePoint has. Right, so it's all recorded in a database somewhere. We just have to be able to address it and say, I want this part of that overall hierarchy. Bring that little bit back to me, right? And we can do that by specifying some keywords and some filters and things like that to get back the information that we want to see in a sorted sequence that we want to see it. However, the feed reading view in the default feed reading view is on in Internet Explorer. So we want to make sure we turn that off and say, we don't want to have you trying to show us that Atom feed as an RSS. You won't see hardly any data at all. It won't be very valuable. So you'll want to go into Internet Explorer. You can see it's under the Content tab and turn off the Turn On feed reading view. By default, it's on. And for those of you that are like right on the cutting edge, Spartan, the new browser for Windows 10, doesn't even have this option. So it has no support for doing any kind of feed reading today. There's a tool that you can get out of the SharePoint store. So if you go into your SharePoint site and you say, I want to add an app, and then you go down to the SharePoint store, you can go out there and get this thing. It's from a couple of friends of ours. They're called SharePoint Friends. Karsten Kootman, right? They call themselves SharePoint Friends. And Anders Dissing, those two guys wrote this little tool. I love it, right? You go ahead and add it in there. When you click on that app, it takes you to a little SharePoint hosted page where you can type in a URL and it will tell you what you would get back in a JSON presentation. Now that's great because you don't have to get some ancillary tools like Fiddler or some other kinds of tools that would let you see the actual correspondence taking place between the browser and the server, right? Using just their little tool, you can sort of peek under the covers and see the JSON objects you're going to get back. Now why is that important? Because we need to know the elements, right? The top level node slash, the next node down slash, and all the way down to the property. So in order for us to know what that looks like, right, we can use this slick little tool called the _API JSON viewer. I see people taking pictures, so I'll leave that for a second. Again, this is just one of the tools you could use. There's a Chrome plugin that will let you see RSS feeds so you can look what that Atom Pub looks like. There's all kinds of JSON viewers out there, so if you want to go ahead and open the file in some kind of client tool, whatever, I'm sure there are lots and lots of preferences here. I just happen to like this one because it's already there in my SharePoint environment. I can just install the app and see what it looks like, and then uninstall the app, and it's out of there. Okay? Works great in the cloud as well. So I mentioned the query string parameters. So not only can we say where in this hierarchy that we want to get something, but we can restrict what comes back by selecting specific field names that we want. Now, if you only have one object, you can literally just get one property. It's the smallest XML or response that you can get back. Hey, for this object, I want this property. Boom, and they'll just send you back that result. All right, but if you want more properties, or if you've got a multitude of objects, a collection of objects, right, then you're going to need to use this $select. I skipped one. $metadata is like the service document. So if you've ever worked with WSDL, right, this is like the WSDL that you would have in a RESTful context. So $metadata can be useful for us to know what's the corpus of things that we can do there. You'd literally just go _API / $metadata, and there you've got it. It's the only $one that doesn't follow a question mark. All the rest of these $ones are not a SharePoint thing. They're not a Microsoft thing, right? They were built by standards bodies saying this is what REST looks like, right? So if you're going to implement REST, OData is a flavor of REST, right? Then these are the things that you need to include. Now, the $filter is a great tool for reducing the amount of the payload of information that comes back to you. $filter will reduce that down so that you only get a subset of the information. Maybe you only want to get one item or all the items that have a given status, or you want all of the lists that are of document type or something like that, right? You can do those things directly through the $filter. You can also expand. So if you're familiar with how SharePoint lists work, we've got lookup fields. And if we've got a lookup field, we can expand all of the items that are looked up into the data that comes back. Now be aware, this is exponential. It isn't hierarchical necessarily, so every time you expand into a parent record, it brings down that parent record's fields, right, for every one. So it's not like you're going to get an in-memory two tables with a relational table in the center. No, the parent records are going to come down in full again and again, even if there's redundant things. But this gives us the ability to have some SharePoint lists that are related to one another and have them bring back the entire corpus of information, right? That whole hierarchy. Order by, skip, top, those are fairly obvious, right? If you want to get the data in a specific order, you want to get a specific set of records, or you maybe want to paginate through the records, right? You can do that with these additional query string parameters. If you want to get a lot of details, you can go to that jump right there, the SP 2013-REST. And there's a whole detailed explanation. All of the REST documentation for SharePoint starts there. All right? Now, I'm not going to go through these in depth. I'm going to literally just go flip, 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 flip. But this is a really nice reference if you're just getting started with REST for what kinds of things you can do on the query string, because initially you're going to go, oh, this is great. And then you're going to go, how do I substring? How do I do math? How do I do date stuff, right? And so this is just a quick summarization of things that you can do. There's some operators there for some mathematical functions. You can see we can group expressions with parentheses, so it works just like you'd expect it to in a mathematical kind of a context. Note that like PowerShell, we have two-digit operators, right? So if we're going to say something is less than something, in PowerShell we'd say -LT. Here we just say LT. All filters are space separated. So it'd be like field space LT space single quoted value. Whenever you're dealing with the query string, we're going to be dealing with single quoted values as strings. So first single quote, whatever the string is, second single quote will mean that's one thing we're passing into that overall query string. All right. There's a few more. Did I duplicate that? Equals, not equals, greater than. You see all of those. Here's some substring functions, substring of, right, so that I can see if something is contained within a field, substring itself, and then starts with. You can all appreciate those, the value of those particular functions. We've got ends with, index of, the length of something, So, hey, I want to know if something is more than 5 characters or is whatever kind of thing you're looking for there. You can trim things off so that the spaces get dropped off on either side so you don't have white space getting in your way of your comparisons. You can replace something. So in this field, I want to replace this with this, right? So you can actually integrate that into your query so that it goes and gets all the things after the replacement is completed. And you can concatenate. So pretty good set of string functions. Think of it this way. What could you do in an Excel spreadsheet cell? You can probably do that here. That's kind of the set of functions that we have available to us. 2 lower, 2 upper, those are obvious. Literals. So sometimes you have to say, what if it's equal to null? Or is this value going to be a double or a byte so that I can check to see what its type is? We've also got the ability to do time offsets. Right, so we can see if the date time is offset by a certain amount of time. Those are literals that we have available to us. We've got mathematical functions like round, floor, ceiling, and is of. Is a particular value of a particular type. So is this column, in this case, a double? You can see that in the bottom there. Year, month, day, hour, minute, second. Probably don't have to go into any detail there, right? You get those things. All right, so whenever we're dealing with this huge hierarchy of information, we've gone to one of those endpoints, we're going to get back either 1 or more objects. If you get back more objects, you're going to have collection methods that you can work with. So for instance, I can get all of a site's webs. I can get all of a web's lists. I can get all of the lists that have a specific title and get their items, right? I can get all of the lists that have these properties. So I'm getting a collection of values back. You might say to yourself, I wonder how he knows what things you can do. You query the parent and you look at the results, it's self-describing, right? It will tell you. You can get the owner. You can go get the date it was created. You can go get the URL. You can go whatever properties are in each of those objects. And then you can specify $select and just pull off the ones you want. So why would I only want to get 2 of the properties instead of just getting them all? Shrink down that payload, right? We're going to be making this request out to the server. We're going to want to bring back only the data that we care about, right? So we're going to go ahead and pull back just the data we're interested in. That said, you might get back a singular object. And if you get back a singular object, you don't have to ask for the columns in a $select. If you know all you're getting back is 1 value, you queried for the item ID, right? Or for the list by title. You're only getting 1 of those back, right? So then you can specify a slash created there on the bottom, right? So if I've got a specific singular item, I can go get its properties 1 at a time. Each time you do that, though, it's another request to the server. So while that is an option, if you're going to use multiple properties, you might want to go ahead and use the $select and get all the fields that you want back for that 1 item. Making sense to you? Right, so this is all in the query string, all in the browser. So we can actually see what this looks like. We can go in and we can take a look at it. That's what we're going to do momentarily. I cannot see that clock whatsoever. So 10 after? Yep. All right, thank you. I'm trying to go through these quickly. Again, you can go back and look at these later. In order for us to work with REST inside of SharePoint, we're going to have to make some HTTP headers. So no matter what context you're in, you're going to have to tell the server what you're trying to do. There are 2 headers that are quite important and quite misunderstood on the internet. One is called the accept header. You only need the accept header if you're trying to get back information, right? And you can say, I accept data as an Atom XML document. That's the default, right? Or I would like to accept the data as a JSON object, currently the most popular, right? Because JSON works in practically every context, right? So if we don't want to get back XML, we're going to have to provide an accept header. That just means when I send the request up to the server, I've got the name accept, and beside it is the value application/JSON. Now that's where you can put a semicolon, OData verbose, OData minimal metadata, or OData no metadata if you're online, right? Otherwise, you are required to put OData verbose. OData equals verbose, literally those characters. I'll show you that in a slide. The second one is content type. Now we only have to specify a content type if we're sending the server some information. We have to tell them, I'm sending you some information and it looks like this. The two most common ones are application/XML plus Atom or JSON. Most of the contexts that we're in, like in SharePoint Designer today, they only understand JSON, right? To do something with the XML, you'd have to parse it yourself with some kind of a tool. So oftentimes we're going to say, hey, we have a JSON object we want to send you. In order to do that, we might have to convert whatever object that we have into a JSON object. And so in JavaScript, there's a JSON stringify that lets us take a JavaScript object and make it into a JSON object so we can send it up to the server, do something with it. We're going to simulate a JSON object in what SharePoint Designer calls a dictionary. Okay, so we're going to make a dictionary, and that will automatically go up to the server as a JSON object. So I can say the content I'm sending you, server, the information you're going to need to perform an update or an insert or a delete can be found in the content type. Now, most of the internet posts I've seen will have you pushing both of those out there all the time. And that's just not necessary. You only need to push out the ones that are required. Now, there are some HTTP methods that require special handling. Are you going to handle that on Wednesday? You going to talk about that? Not really. So there's this thing called HTTP tunneling, and you can specify an XHTTP method as one of your headers. Remember, that's the name. And the value will be, hey, I'm trying to do a put or a merge or a patch. That means I'm trying to update something, but the browser itself doesn't support the update verb. Okay, so that's what that's about. There's a little sample there if you want to see what that looks like. Request digest is something that AC will be handling later this week as well. The idea here is that if you're not in an authenticated SharePoint context, you're outside of that, you might need to let SharePoint know that the user that's working with that has a valid secret from SharePoint. So we talked to SharePoint already. They gave us a secret. I'm passing you back the secret so that you know that I'm not trying to spoof you into doing something you're not supposed to do. So that's kind of the idea of the request digest. Again, there's a simple example there if you want to look at it later. Other contexts, you're literally going to say, hey, I have an identity someplace else and I just want to do this in SharePoint. So you're going to pass in, call it credentials, right? You're going to pass in a bearer token that has the necessary OAuth token so that it can go off and do its thing, okay? Now, if you want to make cross-domain calls, that means that you're trying to do something in SharePoint and it's in SharePoint.com, but you're running over here in Todd.com. You're trying to do a cross-domain call. You're going to have to handle that using some kind of a proxy. In JavaScript, we can use the request executor, and there's a super simple little example there. Again, this is an intro to REST, right? So just went in through those up just so you'd have some reference to them. The last thing that's on the slides is we can also work with files. So oftentimes you hear people talk about, oh, this is great, we can do all of this, and then you go, yeah, but I'd like to sort of work with it's a document library, so I need to push up a file. Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have any code that does that. So it is possible to use the REST protocol to merge files into a document library. There's a URL there that teaches you how you can use the $value operator, right? You can also update using a put and include that $value in your postback, in your content type, okay? The body then will contain the actual document itself so that it goes up and gets into the document library. So so that's REST. Let's talk a little bit about SharePoint Designer. This is the last slide I think I have in this deck. There's some new constructs that we have with SharePoint Designer 2013 that didn't exist before. How many of you have used SharePoint Designer before to do workflows? So I would say 50%. So here's the idea. We're going to use a tool that lets us build a workflow, something that can run on demand or because an event occurred, either because somebody inserted a document or updated a list item, and that will cause the workflow to run. It's also possible to just cause it to run with code. Okay, so somehow this workflow starts to run. And when it starts to run, it can run a little bit and then stop and go to sleep. So it comes out of memory, it just sits there waiting for something to happen. When that thing happens, it wakes up again and continues running. Now, we can write no-code workflows, and we can use them within the context of Office 365. We don't upload some custom code. We literally just upload a workflow. From that context, we're going to make our REST calls. Okay, so our REST calls are going to be coming from the context of a SharePoint Designer workflow. Inside of there, we're going to create stages and loops. That's the bottom one there. Stages and loops are new. I usually like to say we used to have a construct within SharePoint. We still have the construct within SharePoint Designer, which is a rectangle that it's a comment block, if you will. And it says, these are the steps I'm going to do, but it's just a comment block. Right? We can insert one of those, or we can insert a comment block and give it a name. We call it a stage, and it becomes a callable block of statements. Okay, that's called a stage. I'm just going to barely just sort of introduce that to you, like we can have a stage that calls another stage. That means that I can recall that stage again and again. I write the code once, and then I can call into it again and again. Now, the most complicated thing we're going to do is call the HTTP web service that's going to include the request header with either the accept and or the content type header, right? And maybe the payload that we're going to use to send to the server. Then we're going to dictate what we're going to do with the response. When the response comes back, I've noted that doing a for each loop through that response is not necessarily intuitive. Right? It's not evident how we're going to do that. So we're going to do two very simple calls today. In the demo, we're going to log the titles of a specific SharePoint list. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to write a workflow that when we kick it off, and we're just going to manually kick it off, we're going to go get the values out of a list, and then we're going to write them into the log. So we're going to query the list, and we're going to write all of the titles into a log. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to turn around and we're going to write a second workflow. And that one is going to bundle up some information and insert it as a new item into a SharePoint list. So those two things. If you understand how to do those two things, you can probably take it from there, right? And go off and do the advanced stuff that AC will talk about later this week. So those are our two things. We're going to log the titles, and then we're going to insert an item. All right, questions so far? Anybody got something that I covered that you're like, I don't quite get what you said there? You want to yell it out? Brave soul? Wow, that's amazing. Probably more human behavior here, right?
Throttling concerns when you do REST calls?
Oh, very good. Are there any throttling concerns? And the idea is that I'm going to be making lots and lots and lots of requests within a specific period of time, right? And so there, in Office 365, you can have, do you remember what's it called? So there is one, but it's really not the way you can judge it, if you will. So go ahead.
You don't really have to worry about it, unless you're building an app that's calling the same one, that you're scaling it out like tons and tons of those.
Lots and lots of.
If it's just users interacting with it, making REST calls, you can't make requests fast enough to do that.
I would agree.
But
on-prem, you're not going to fight that battle today until SharePoint 2016 comes along and they implement that locally, right? Online, because they're trying to set up SharePoint for the world, they went ahead and put some caps in there, so if somebody's going crazy, but you shouldn't run into any problems unless you're trying to. Usually it comes when you're trying to provision out a new something. That's when you see a problem.
what about item counts, when you get a lot of items back?
Well, yeah, we can get an item count. I'm going to do that. So we're going to query out, we're going to bring back the information, we're going to check it, and we're going to get, well, you want to just do an item count so you know how many, and you can do that as well.
Oh, yeah, sort of, yeah.
Yes. All right, let's go ahead and let's do these two simple little demos. How much time do I got? Got about 25 minutes. I think that's good. So I went ahead and created a SharePoint site. I've got one little list here called test, and in the test list, I've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's just a custom list. Standard custom list with 4 values in the title column. What we want to do is see if we can query that list using REST to get that information out and then iterate through it. Now, I've had some people ask me, well, why would you ever want to do that? There's a plethora of business scenarios where you want to be able to query a specific set of items and then iterate through them in order to make a decision. right, about what you should do next, maybe who you should notify, or what the current value of something else is in order to determine what to do with this thing. Or maybe I just want to sum everything up and give an executive some kind of a summary or something like that. So I'm not presenting this as a BI alternative. I'm just saying we can get at the data and we can do whatever we want with it. So we can iterate through it, and we're going to just write it out to the history list. Okay, so there's my list. I also opened up SharePoint Designer over here, and we're going to go ahead and go to the workflows, and we're going to create a new SharePoint Evo workflow. So I'm going to say I want a list, or sorry, I'm going to just make a site workflow. We're going to automatically kick this off, or manually kick this off. So when we do, we'll ask the user, well, what list would you like to query? And at first, we'll just query the test list, because that's a simple one. But then we'll prove that we can do this on any list that has a title column. We can go query any list that has a title column, which is most of our lists, right? So let's call this one Evo log titles. It's a SharePoint 2013 workflow, and it's going to give us the ability to write stages, and we can loop and do those kinds of things. So right away, you can see we've got a stage. Remember, that's just a named block of statements. Up here, you can see where we have a step. Think of that as a comment block. It's that these statements are going to do something. It's a rectangle around some statements that you can put a comment on, right? If I want that commented set of statements to be callable, then I'll make it a stage. Stages must be at the top level of any workflow. So the first thing that we're going to do in our first stage here is we're going to get the items. And then we're going to go ahead and go to our second stage, and we're going to output their titles. So I'm going to add a second stage. Notice that that's available as a non-grayed out element because we are on the outside of all of the stages, so we can make a peer, if you will. We're going to output the titles then. And these two stages are now callable, right? So how do I call into these guys? Well, the first one here, once I get all the items, I'm going to output them. So I'm just going to right-click on here and say I want to go to a stage. Go to a stage. Which one do you want to go to? I want to go to the output titles stage. Whereas at the bottom here, I'm going to right-click and say, hey, I want to go to the end of the workflow. So I click on a stage and pick end of workflow. Make sense, everybody? All right. So that's our simple little workflow. I like to go in and put comments and so forth so that we know where we're going. I do that by putting log entries, right? These are fairly straightforward. Get items, output titles. So I'm not going to necessarily do the log entries, but feel free to be pretty liberal about logging out whatever's happening in a workflow so that when somebody comes back and looks at it, they go, oh, I see what's going on. Or if they look at a running one, they can see what's happening, where things are happening. Now, the nice thing is that a SharePoint 2013 workflow will automatically tell you which stage it's currently running in. So if you look at the running workflow, it'll say, hey, I'm starting in get items. Then now I'm in output titles and so forth, right? So however many stages I've got, it'll update the status for me automatically. Or I can choose to set the status myself. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create that JSON header that we talked about. Now, we're going to try to query SharePoint and get back those list items. What kind of an HTTP header do I need to pass up to it? An accept or a content type? An accept. Right? Because I'm going to say, hey, SharePoint, can you give me something back as a JSON object? So I need an accept header here. The way we pass information up to SharePoint in the HTTP header is we create a dictionary object. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and say I want to build a dictionary object. Then it gives me this little build dictionary and output to what variable. Can you guys see that in the back? Yeah? Okay, I see heads nodding. That's good. I'm going to click on this. And it gives me a dialog where I can start adding name-value pairs. The name-value pairs that I want to use in this case are just the accept and then the application/JSON and then whatever OData I'd like to use, OData verbose in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and say I've got an accept header. And the value is going to be application/JSON. That says give me back a JSON object, because otherwise what am I going to get? XML. I'm going to get an Atom XML, and SharePoint Designer is going to go, what'd you give me? I don't know what to do with that, right? So we got to convert it to a JSON object. And then I'm going to put a semicolon and type OData equals verbose. Now, today, I can, on Office 365's SharePoint Online, I can just eliminate that entirely and get back minimal metadata. But if I want all of the information that I can know about the object, then I need to still type OData equals verbose, right? Or if I want the smallest payload possible, just tell me the one thing I was asking for, right? Then I can say no metadata. So OData equals no metadata. That's that JSON Light I was talking about. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and I have a new dictionary object. And I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to change the name of the variable to JSON headers. You can call this anything you'd like. Oh, sorry, is that what I want to call it? Yeah, JSON headers. And it's of type dictionary, right? So I now have a set of name value pairs, except JSON. I want to pass that in to a specific location. Where do I want to pass that into? Well, I'm going to kick off the workflow to run in a given context. I'm going to look for the list in that context. That's kind of a complicated URL to create. So we're going to create a variable that holds the URL value, right? So the way I'm going to do that is I'm literally going to set, just type the word set, and then it says, do you want to set a time portion, a workflow status, or a workflow variable? I'm literally just creating an in-memory location where I'm going to keep track of a string, in this case, the URL. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I'd like to set a workflow variable. It says, OK, well, what do you want that variable to be called? Just like with the JSON headers, I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call mine conveniently URL. And it's going to be of type string. So I'm just going to construct a URL right here. Now, if I go back over to the browser, let's see what this might look like. So I want to query this list, right? I want to go query the test list. What we learned in the first set of slides was that we've got an endpoint called site, another one called web, and some other ones like search and user profiles and so forth, right? We're looking for the contents of a web, right? So if I come back up to my URL right here, and I specify after my site, so Evo is my site. I'm going to try to zoom into that. What happened to my zoomer? Let me see if I can get it real quick. That's not what I want. Downloads, zoom it. You won't be able to see the URLs if I don't do something. So I was running it earlier. There we go. OK, so you can see this is my site collection, my site called Evo. From after Evo, I'm going to type /_API. Now, since I'm in Internet Explorer, I had to have turned on _API and then /web, let's just say. So I get back a response that lets me work with, oh, this is going to give me an Atom Pub response, right? Because I didn't give it an accept header, so the default is going to be XML. And I think Internet Explorer and Windows 10 running the Spartan engine completely cacks on this. It doesn't know what to do. It's kind of stuck. So even though I've got the friendly URLs turned on and everything, I went ahead and installed that _API JSON viewer. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and go into that guy so you can see what the response is going to look like in a JSON format. Again, this is just an app that you can use. They default to the current site's API _API/web. Right? So you can see all the kinds of things that I can do in here. Let me go ahead and bump that up a little bit. First of all, notice that it all starts with a top-level element called D. So if I wanted something out of here, I was going to extract it out of a dictionary object, I would say D/. That would be the first thing that I have to specify. Then there's some metadata here. There's some things I can get to, like role assignments, all properties, app titles. Let me scroll down a little way so you can see some familiar things. Event receivers, features, fields, folders, lists. Hey, that's a popular one, right? So I can go query this object's collection of lists. So if I go /_API/web/lists, right, I'm going to get back a collection of lists. Let's try that. So this little helper lets me come up to the top, change /web to /web/lists. And now it's going to change the actual results down here. It's D/results, right? And then it's going to give me one list after another. If I scroll down past the collections that each list has, so that's the collections that I could access from this list. If I scroll down just a little bit further, I'll find the title. And this one is the composed looks list. Right? And so all the lists and libraries in this web are coming back. Look at the scroll bar. It's big, right? There's a lot to scroll because that's a lot of information. We talked about the fact that if we were going to use REST, to get back a collection of things, but I only wanted one property from each item in the collection, I need to use the $select, right? So if I come back up to the top of that, and I modify that URL to say, I want to use a query string parameter, $select, equals, then I can specify the thing that I'm looking for. Let's just say title. So I'm going to get just the title column back from each list. When I do that and I run that query, I should get back composed looks, documents, FD, whatever that is, masterpiece gallery, etc. All right? So each one of those is an object that has that property. Now, if I wanted more than just the title, I could put a comma delimited list. So I could say title, comma, URL, comma, creator, etc., stuff like that. All right? So what do we want? Well, we want the items of a specific list. This is where we can get into some of those SharePoint-specific methods. Right? One of the methods is, in the collection of lists, give me a specific list, and I can get that list using its title. So I can say lists / get by title, and then pass in a single quote delimited list title inside of parentheses. It looks like this. It's a method, right? So get by title, and then parentheses. Inside of there is single quotes, and inside of there is the name of my list, in this case, test. So I'm going to go get my test list, and it brings me back information about the test list. Lots of collections and then lots of properties here, right? If I only wanted one property, because I only have one object, I could say / let's just say title, which should be test, right? So if I go ahead and specify that, you can see I get a very, very small d/title. That's all I'd have to do to reference the contents of that JSON object. So far, so good? By the way, take a look at over here. And the R&R, my request header, has an accept JSON. That's how come I'm getting back a JSON object instead of an XML object. In this tool, they don't let you tweak that. If you're in Fiddler or something like that, you can twist that to whatever you'd like it to be. And then there's my response header. So the things that I'm sending in, these are automatically being sent. Here's the content type. That's the one I wanted you to see, content type. All right. So, whoops, I went back. I did not want to do that. Stay in that application. So what do we want? We want to go to web/lists / get by title. And then we want to specify the title called test, or whatever list or library you're trying to go after, right? And then we want to go ahead and specify what column we want to get back. Since we only want the title column, we can literally just say title. It used to be that this was case sensitive. It's not anymore. You can use upper or lowercase. It doesn't matter. But I have a rule. It says if I always use the proper case, I'm never wrong. So if I'm in a case sensitive or case insensitive, it doesn't matter. It's going to work. All right, so this is the URL that I'd like to use. You can see how nice it is that I'm able to go ahead and query this information. Oh, sorry, I said that's the list's title. I actually want a collection inside of the list called items. Remember the items? And I want to go ahead and get the title of each item. So I'm going to say $select, because there's more than one item, equals title. I keep saying capitalized, but it doesn't go there. All right, so here's my results. D results. Title is 1, title is 2, title is 3 with a little bit of metadata. Pretty cool, huh? Let's take that idea, what we can see in the browser of just a get, and let's translate it into a call within SharePoint Designer. All right, so I'm going to go back to my SharePoint Designer and say I would like to make an HTTP call. Just before I do that, I like to go ahead and log, just type log, log out to the history list, the URL that I went to make sure I've concatenated that incorrectly. All right, so I'm going to say I want to log the URL, and I'm going to make that equal to, just add in the value. And now there's only 4 places I can actually get values. Whenever you see this lookup in SharePoint Designer, it means where do you want to get the value from? I can either get it from workflow, I can get it from the current item, I can get it from the tasks list, or someplace else. Someplace else is uncommon. So one of those 3 places is the most likely place I'm looking for. Since I defined a variable within the workflow called URL, I should be able to go to the workflow variables and find the URL. So I'm going to go get the URL as a string, and I'm going to put it in, concatenate it into the string that goes into the log. So that's the idea there. In order to do this, then I better set the value of the URL, right? So I'm going to click on the URL value. Once again, I'm going to go into this little builder. I'm going to say the first thing that I would like to get is the workflow context. Remember, I can get from the workflow, the current item, or the tasks list. I'm going to go for the workflow context, and that's where the current site's URL is. So I'm going to start this with the current site's URL, and then I want to concatenate all that stuff that we had over here, right? So when we were trying this all out, we saw that we wanted to start with underscore API, blah, 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 all of that stuff. So I'm going to copy that URL that we tested and just paste it in. Note that right here, I do not have a slash because the current URL always ends with a slash. So I know I'm just going to pick it up from wherever the root of the current web is. So that should work for us. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now I've got the URL that I want to go call, right, and the header I want to pass it. So let's go ahead and grab that data out of SharePoint. We're going to do that by making a call. Just type call to the HTTP web service. It says, hey, you want to call this URL, and you want to pass it this request and get this response with these response headers into this response code. The one thing that's not listed up there is the most common thing you need to set. We need a set of request headers. We need to send headers up with our requests saying what we want the data to look like when it comes back. So it's not in the clickable set of blue underscores, right? So if I right-click on this, I can go to Properties, and in the Advanced Properties, I get those details. So in the Advanced Properties, I can see my request headers. Okay, so once I'm in here, I don't know why they didn't put that one in the clickable things, because I think it's a really common one to need. But that's how you get past that little sort of spot where you get stuck. So first thing I want to do is give it the address. I'm going to go ahead and just go out to the function list, find my workflow variable called URL. That's going to be what I'm going to query. And I want to pass in my request headers. So I'm going to drop down this drop-down list and pick my JSON headers to send up there. Then I want my content, my response content, to come back. I'm going to go ahead and create a new variable for the content that comes back from that query. Just make a new variable there called call content. And it's a dictionary object, so it's going to come back basically as JSON and get converted into a dictionary object for me, something SharePoint Designer understands. And then finally, at the very bottom here, they automatically created the response code. So I can check the response code and see how well this went. In fact, let's do that. If the response is good, we want to go ahead and parse out the items that it sent us, because it's going to be inside of D, result, item, 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 item. So we want to pull those items out. Here's why. Later we're going to do a for each loop. And when we're looping through, we need to know how many items are going to be in there. If you ask the D how many things are in it, it's going to say 1, it's called results. You're going to be like, no, 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 I want to know how many items are inside of your results. So we're going to pull those out as a separate variable called items. We do that with relative ease. I'm simply going to say if the response code, so I'm just going to go looking for that response code in the workflow variables. If the response code is OK. And remember, you're going to have a screenshot of this if you go to that URL at the, that I gave you at the beginning, and I'll give you at the end. Right? If the response code is OK, then I want to go ahead and parse out the results. Right? So I'm going to say, this is a key one. I want to get, put the cursor, the orange blinky bar in there, get the term called D/results. That's how I specify the specific aspect of that JSON object that came back. So I say I want to get the results out of there, and I want to put it into its own dictionary object. I'm going to just make a new one called items. That dictionary object, I said that backwards. I want to get it from the call content, and I want to output it into items. Okay, so I'm going to just go get that subsection of items out of the overall payload that we got back. Otherwise, I want an else branch, and in the else branch, I want to go ahead and say there was a problem, right? So I'm going to say, go ahead and log that there was a problem. In fact, I don't even need a log. I can just set the status. Let's do that. So I'm going to say in my else branch, which I think I just lost. Sorry about that. I'm going to set the workflow status so that when this leaves, it goes, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm going to set the workflow status to error. I think I actually have to go into the ellipsis to type this thing. Error, and then concatenate it in with the response code. So we know that something went wrong and this is what it was. So we're going to log out the error. I'm going to go ahead and add that as a workflow variable response code. Click OK, and click OK. The last thing we need to do is we need to alter this. Go to the output. We don't want to do that if there was an error. So we want to check to see if there was an error, go ahead and go someplace else first. Unfortunately, if I right-click here, it won't let me do anything until I delete that one. And then I can enter an if statement. So if I enter my if statement here, I can do the exact same thing I did up here, right? I can say, hey, if the variable called response code is OK, then let's go ahead and go to the output. So how do we output this guy? Go to a stage called output titles. Otherwise, we would just want to end the workflow. We've already said there was an error, so we want to just be done. OK, the last thing we want to do down here is we want to go ahead and do the output titles. Fortunately, it's shorter than that one because I'm running out of time. Outputting the titles. Unfortunately, they didn't give us the for each loop that we really wanted or needed. Right? We kind of have to craft the for each loop for us. But we have a dictionary object with items in it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find out how many items are in that list. And then we're going to set a variable saying we're starting at item 0, and we're going to iterate through all of them until we're done. We're just going to write out to the history list. The way that's done is we're simply going to count the items that are in a dictionary object. In this case, we're going to count all the items. And we'll stick that into a variable called item count. So now we know how many there are, right? We're going to set up an indexer just below that. So I'm just going to set a variable, a workflow variable. I'm just going to call it index because we're all familiar with that kind of a concept. And I'm going to make it of type integer. So I've got an indexer that I can do. I'm going to set that to a value of 0, saying I'm going to start with the very first one. Then I can do the loop that's new to this version of SharePoint. So I can go ahead and loop a certain number of times. In this case, I'm going to loop the number of times that we counted. Right? So it starts out with the word loop 1, which is a very goofy thing to do. If you go ahead and set this down here, it will give you a chance to update the loop to have an actual name. So if I click on the 1 here, you can see the title is currently set to loop 1. So it's the first loop we're going to do, if you will. I'm going to say we're going to log the titles of the history list. You can call that anything you want, right? But log the titles to the history list. And then finally, my repeat count is going to be that variable, right? That starts out at 0, and I'm just going to increment it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the function key, drop this down and say, I would like to use the item count as the indexer. No, I want to loop the item count number of times. That's what we want to do. Click OK, and click OK. So now that loop is going to go however many items there are in our response. So we've got to go ahead and grab out the title. Inside of the loop, we've got to grab out the title and log it. 4 more steps. OK, so to get the title, we want to go ahead and create a variable from an item inside of the dictionary. So we're going to go get the item. Now, the way that the item is specified, we already have an object. We're on a specific object. We just need to know the 0th one, or the 1th one, or the 2th one. So we're going to put in parentheses. I'm going to click on this ellipsis, so hopefully you can see this a little bit better. I'm going to put parentheses 0/title. That's the remaining little bit that we have to get out of the d/results item, right, /title. However, we need to make this variable, right? That 0 needs to get replaced with the actual index that we're on. So we're going to replace that 0 with a dynamic value of the index that we're on. Go ahead and say add or change the index. Click OK. And now we're going to get the title of the current one, and then the title of the next one, title of the next one. In order to make that work, we have to go ahead and iterate that index, right? Before we do, let's go ahead and log out. Oh, I didn't give it a name. From the dictionary object called items with an output called title. So we're just going to save aside the title of each one as it goes through. Then we're going to go ahead and log it. Log to the history list. We're going to go ahead and just log out that title that we just extracted. From the variables, we're going to grab the title. And the last thing we have to do is we have to iterate the indexer. What would we normally do? Just index plus plus. And then we'd be done, right? However, we have a problem. Because they didn't give us index plus plus capability, we literally have to set up a temporary variable and add one to the current index into a new variable, and then set the index variable equal to the temporary variable. So we have to do 2 steps here. I'll just do them quickly here. So I'm going to go ahead and set a workflow variable. I like to go ahead and call it index plus plus so that I know what in the heck it's there for. Index plus plus. And it's going to be a number. And the value of that is simply going to be, whoops, I need to go to the ellipses here. Oh, sorry, I did the wrong thing. That's coming in a second. We're going to set the index variable equal to the index plus plus. But I need to set the index plus plus first. So let me do that quick. Index plus plus. All right, so all I did is I said I'm going to set the index to a specific temporary variable. Let's go up just above that and create that. So I'm going to calculate the value of the index plus plus variable. So I'm going to say go ahead and get the index variable and add 1 to it. Index plus 1, and put it into an output variable called index plus plus. I know. You would think all I'd have to do is say, please iterate this collection for me. But you have to do all of that, and that's what you have to do. The last thing I want to do is, since we might have set the error code up here to be an error code, down here I'm going to go ahead and set the workflow status equal to completed. And that should be it. Go ahead and publish that out. When we're done publishing this, we should be able to go in and kick off the workflow, and it's going to go grab all of the items out of the test list, and it's going to write them into the workflow. What happened? Anybody know where it is? Some reason it doesn't set the workflow variable. Occasionally this just breaks. It's a SharePoint Designer bug. So I'm going to go ahead and just add it back in. I've seen this before. Just add the variable back in, click OK, and click OK. And I think, let's check for errors. Yeah, now it's fine. I'm not sure why, but sometimes when you tell SharePoint Designer that you want to use a variable, and then you go do a bunch of work, when you come back it says, I don't know what variable you're talking about. You're like, OK, I'll just set it again. Not sure why, but there you go. All right, so I'm going to come back into my SharePoint site, and I should be able to kick off this variable. Now, since I'm running out of time, let me just point out that if you go to the URL that I gave you at the beginning, and I'll show it to you at the very end here, right, you can get screenshots, and it will walk you through how you set up the very same thing to insert an item into that test list, right? I'm going to go to my Evo site and go to the site contents. Oops, there we go. And from the site contents, I can get to my site workflows. And so I created a new site workflow, and we used the REST API to query into that list and then for each through the results. So I should be able to go to Evo log titles, and it should start that workflow. Unfortunately, it doesn't show you that it's running unless you refresh this screen. And then it can take a little bit of time to run in Office 365. I'm not sure why it takes so long to run sometimes, because it's just going out there, just literally reading it quickly. But I'm guessing that if you're trying to host workflow for the world, that's probably where the rub is. So if I click on this, Evo log titles, we should see that it went ahead and logged 1, 2, 3, 4 into the history list. It also told me which URL I was after, so I could see if there was a concatenation issue, how I could fix it up. So the concept here is that we can use the REST API within a SharePoint Designer context, or within a SharePoint context. We don't have to worry about the OAuth tokens. We don't have to worry about many of the things that Andrew will present on Friday when he talks about Breeze, right? But we've really made it possible for us to do something in SharePoint Designer that we would have otherwise not been able to do at all. All right? Let me go ahead and flip up the slide deck so you can see where that URL is. If you go to the jump, it's called Evo SPD-REST. You can get screenshots of what that looks like. You can see how to insert an item, and you can replicate what I did in the one that you saw there. In fact, here, if I just quickly show you the demo of that, I'll just jump back over here. I went ahead and created what they call in England the Blue Peter, right? Julia Child in the United States. If I go to insert item here, you can see that it's going to prompt me for what list do I want. I'll do the test list. I'll go ahead and put number 5 in there and click start. And that's going to do the same basic premise, right? It's going to build up dictionary objects. We're going to send them up to the server. It's going to do the work. And then we'll see that that workflow, when it's completed running, has inserted a new item into that test list. So if I simply go back to the list, I can see that in the test list, presuming the workflow is done, that I have number 5. Or whatever I would type in there. Make sense? All right, that's it for my presentation. I hope that you can go out and follow the screenshots. All right?